on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
If you're a Michelin aspiring chef, you're going to have some wild foods on your menu.
It gives you a lot of motivation as a cook, right? When you have an ingredient, something you harvested yourself, the treatment of that ingredient can really inspire the cooking process.
These mushrooms have relationships with trees. So I often tell my students, if you want to learn about mushrooms, learn your trees first.
It seems like if any species can get us to start to shift how we're behaving, it seems like the Pacific salmon might be able to do that.
Whenever those first people decided that they were going, across the Bering Sea, it was really the salmon that kept them alive.
One of my favorite pieces of feedback is I didn't realize foraging could be exciting or an adventure. Now I'm like, oh, yeah, it is.
Have an experience, to have an adventure, to do this with friends. I want them to have fun out there. This is fun.
Episode 56 of the WildFed podcast, Fat of the Land, Mushrooms, Salmon, and X-Rated Clams with Langdon Cook is brought to you by Surthrival. Right now, the coupon code VITALITY gets you 15% off Surthrival's Wild Chaga Mushroom Dual Extract. Remember, the immunobenefits of chaga, and this is true of a lot of medicinal mushrooms, is found in the hot water-soluble fraction of the mushroom, but the adaptogenic compounds are found in the alcohol-soluble fraction. Unlike most companies which just use one extract, Surthrival extracts both fractions and then recombines them and adds a touch of vanilla and maple syrup for the most delicious, health-enhancing tincture you've ever tasted. Go to surthrival.com by November 19th and use the coupon code VITALITY for 15% off. Hey, do you want to learn to tan your own hides at home? Then listen up, because this next offer is going fast. Our friends at wildabundance.net are offering an incredible video-based online hide tanning course, and registration is open right now. In fact, this is last call because registration closes on November 19th. Remember, you don't have to have your own deer hide to participate. Wild Abundance will show you how to get a raw hide locally. And by the way, it's really easy right now because game butchers are overloaded with hides from this hunting season and that they're just begging to give away. Or Wild Abundance will even send you one at a really affordable price. If you've been wanting to learn to brain tan your own deer hides, don't miss this course. I harvested a buck this season and I'm planning to follow along with the course too, so join me by going to wildabundance.net and clicking on online courses. You'll see the hide tanning course there. Remember, this course includes video tutorials of the entire process, a written course manual, community forums, live Q&As, and of course, lifetime access to the course content. Wild Abundance wants everyone to participate, so they're offering some scholarships and a sliding pay scale. And for those paying full price, you can get 10% off your order using the coupon code WildFed. Don't miss this opportunity to learn this ancestral skill. Join me on the Wild Abundance online hide tanning course. Again, go to wildabundance.net and use the coupon code WildFed for 10% off. Well, I just want to send a big thanks to everyone who's been sending me pictures of themselves hunting in their WildFed Blaze Orange trucker hats this season, and a congratulations to everyone that's harvested their deer already. It's been really fun to see people succeed in feeding themselves through the ancient and very human practice of hunting. From young does and button bucks to huge studs with massive racks, your photos have been awesome. If you harvest a deer this season, no matter what hat you're wearing, go ahead and tag me and WildFed in your picture this year. It's awesome to see you harvesting wild venison and expressing all your gratitude for the animals that'll feed you and your families this winter. Also, I've been posting 3 times a week on the WildFed Instagram. That's at wild.fed. So be sure to give me a follow over there to see all the great content we're putting out. And if you're not signed up for our twice-a-month newsletter, The Subsistence, go over to wild-fed.com and get on that list. We put out great content, bonus videos, photos, and blogs, and many of our guests on the show submit awesome content there too. Lastly, WildFed, the TV show, hits cable in January, so stay tuned for updates. We'll be announcing all of that real soon.
I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. I'm excited to be talking to Langdon Cook today, author of several excellent books on wild foods, foraging, and fishing. His first is Fat of the Land, Adventures of a 21st Century Forager. That fantastic book was followed by The Mushroom Hunters on the Trail of an Underground America, and most recently his outstanding book on salmon, Upstream.
searching for wild salmon from river to table. Langdon's established himself as one of the most prominent voices in wild food culture, and today we get a glimpse of how he got there, how his books came to be, and where he sees it all going in the future. If you haven't read these books, I highly recommend them, and yes, they are available on audio, so if you're on the go, these books aren't just super inspiring, they're also easily accessible. We cover a lot of ground and water in this episode, from digging the bizarre and almost inappropriate gooey duck clam in Puget Sound, to his mushroom foraging adventures in China, to the perilous status of the Pacific salmon fishery. Langdon is not just knowledgeable and experienced, but he's a lot of fun to talk to. So give him a listen, get yourself his books, and give him a follow on social media. He's definitely one of the important voices in our ever-growing community of not just foragers, but citizen ecologists. People who, through food, and sometimes unwittingly, eventually find themselves as stewards of the ecology they harvest from. Langdon Cook, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be with you, Daniel.
Man, I'm really happy to be talking to you. I think your books are fantastic, and you're such a key player in the whole world of wild foods. And so I kind of like to start off by just having you tell us a little bit about some of the things you've accomplished. I was just looking over your bio, and yeah, it's not just me who likes your books.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. It's funny because I never expected to sort of be here doing this. It's sort of one accident has led to another. The writing piece was something that I was always interested in. When I was younger, I wanted to be a novelist. And at a certain point in my life, I discovered that I could write nonfiction using the toolbox of a novelist and have a lot of fun doing that. But it took a while before I realized that foraging would be my subject matter. I can take you way back if you want to the origins.
Well, I'm curious, because I guess the question I'd ask is, were you a writer who got into wild foods, or a wild food person who got into writing, or did you have the spark for both of these things and then they merged later?
I was a writer before I was interested in wild foods. That's for sure. I mean, that's something that I have been doing really since my high school years. And I've been a big reader all my life. I grew up on the East Coast. My formative years were in Connecticut, and I did stints in New Hampshire and Vermont as well. And I guess you could say I was kind of a nature boy from the get-go. Mm-hmm. I grew up on about 4 acres of land, and until my sister came along when I was 7, I was an only child, and so the woods were kind of like my siblings. And I spent a lot of time just out in the woods, rambling around, turning over rocks, putting bugs in terrariums. I became a bird watcher at a very young age. And just, having fun out there kind of by myself, really.
What year were you born?
End of 66. December 66. Yeah.
Yeah. And growing up, I'm from New Hampshire originally, now in Maine. And so, on the East Coast, growing up here, it's, even the parts that are urban are still kind of rural. And, so, it's not hard to find a patch of woods to spend your time in, right? It's like, and when we were growing up, I feel like, it's a different era where you could leave your kids out all day and, just kind of explore nature.
That's right. I mean, I was building bike jumps and had my banana seat Schwinn, and catching ridiculous amounts of air. And, there were no parental eyes on any of that.
Right. The good old days.
And doing a lot of rambling in the woods, and probably on other people's property, But you can imagine the sort of New England town with the rock walls everywhere, that used to be agricultural demarcations and had since, filled in with woodlots. And the woods, kind of just stretched on as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, 4 acres when you're a kid can feel like a lot too, right? I mean,
yeah, 4 acres and then plus all the neighbors,
Right. Yeah,
so,
of course.
So I had a nice little habitat to grow up on and really sort of learn the rudimentary aspects of the natural world. And then, I actually kind of got a little bit away from that through my high school and college years. And then when I finished up college, I just went west immediately. And ended up in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, where
all the way west.
got in the car and drove, and hit the other coast, and that's where I got my first newspaper jobs in the Bay Area. And then a couple of years later, I wound up in Seattle, and it was really those sort of early post-college years of being on the West Coast that I just sort of jumped back into it in a big way, spending a lot of time backpacking, mountain biking, backcountry skiing, doing all that sort of stuff, really in true wilderness, which was different from what I grew up with. And I guess, there was
well, actually, let's imagine somebody's living in like Nebraska and they
Sure.
don't know the East Coast or the West Coast. Could you kind of characterize it? Because we have woods on both sides, but they are totally different worlds.
That's true. And I don't want to sort of demean either one. I mean, the Green Mountains of Vermont and the White Mountains of New Hampshire were wonderful places to really sort of cut my teeth. And I spent some time down in the Blue Ridge in the Carolinas as well. And very different landscapes, though. Obviously, you don't have the sort of tall mountain peaks that we have out in the West, but you have these beautiful kind of very old mountains covered in deciduous forests that, of course, create the beautiful fall colors. And actually, the woods have, in many ways, a lot more diversity on the East Coast. Just so many more different species of trees, which is great for the mushroom forager. Out here, we have these expansive conifer woodlands. The Cascades and the Olympics would be my sort of local mountain ranges. And we just have a real variety of eco zones. So, a couple hours from my home in Seattle, I can be in the rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula where it might rain 200 inches a year.
Wow.
Or going 2 hours in the other direction, going east, I can be east of the Cascades in the sort of inland, high desert canyon country,
right,
where it might only rain a few inches every year. So I have a great launch pad right here in Seattle to just take in all kinds of different environments. And then, of course, we have Puget Sound here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So that offers an awful lot to the forager.
Yeah. We both share mountains, we share forest, we share coast, but they are just so different. Here, one of the things that strikes me about our mountain range, the Appalachians, is that they've been ground down by the last ice age. And we have this old and stable geology. What I love about the Northeast is it's like no hurricanes, no earthquakes, no tornadoes, no tsunamis. Like this is a stable place, but it's also kind of intellectually a bit rigid, emotionally a bit rigid compared, I'd say, to the West Coast where it's like so much more expansive out there and the ways people think.
Are you sort of thinking about that kind of traditional Yankee stoicism?
Yeah, and then still this like colonialism there's the stoicism and the sort of what would you call it, the properness of the pilgrims still here. You know what I mean?
That
like
Puritan aspect.
Yeah, it's that Puritanism, exactly.
Very alive and well. And I have to say that was one of the reasons why I just decided to hop in the car and go west. I really wanted to maybe sort of shake off those shackles a little bit. I do find sometimes that there is a social structure that is somewhat ossified. And of course, you can have a lot of fun, kind of breaking free of that on the East Coast. I mean, you don't have to be constrained by it. But certainly I hear what you're saying. I mean, there is that kind of Yankee ethos. And I think I was just very much kind of bowled over by the mythology of the West. The sense that it was a place that you could, come to kind of remake yourself in a way. And I guess that's kind of what I did.
Yeah. I also feel when I'm in the Pacific Northwest in particular, there's the indigenous traditions are so much more, how do you say it? I don't say they're alive as much as all of that was so recent compared to the East Coast, where you have hundreds and hundreds of years of colonization, right. but so many of the feeling tone out there is that you feel the indigenous part of the landscape and the people of that area in a more modern kind of sense than you do out here. It's almost gone here. Unless you really go looking for it.
I mean, obviously, there's a lot of trauma that is associated with, just the colonization by Europeans of this area, but those traditions are still alive. And, you can go find those societies up and down, for instance, the Columbia River, the salmon people who are carrying on with those age-old traditions. And that's very inspiring.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel it with the salmon too. Obviously you wrote a book about salmon, which we'll talk about, but we've got Atlantic salmon here, but only just tenuously hanging on, on the endangered species list, and not a viable fishery anymore. Whereas in the West, this almost kind of characterizes what we're talking about, is you still have these 5 Pacific salmon species. They're still running. They're still viable fisheries. It's not perfect, obviously, and there's a lot of threats, but that's still like a living tradition there. Whereas what fed the people of the Northeast for so long is like basically gone. And so, I think we have an incredible wild food tradition out here still, but I think that's one of those things. There's that wildness in the landscape out there still that has been kind of domesticated here.
I write about that in my book Upstream, and we can get into some of this later. But, when I was growing up in New England, whether I was in Connecticut or New Hampshire or Vermont, I was never far from the Connecticut River, which, historically was a very important Atlantic salmon stream. And yet I had no idea growing up that there was a salmon culture, there. And so that really has been lost to a large degree. And I fear that we're losing it out here on the West Coast as well, because, the same historical processes are now happening here. It's just been moving, from east to west, from Europe to the East Coast of North America and now to the West Coast. And, obviously there are a lot of people who are working hard to prevent that from happening. But these sort of historical forces are so powerful. It's hard to hang on to these traditions. And I'll tell you, based on the salmon fishing year that I've had this year, it just, oh boy, it was rough. So last couple of years have been tough. And of course these things are cyclical. And you hope that maybe there are larger cycles at work that, this is all part of, but I can't help but think that I've seen, just in my short time on the West Coast, about 30 years now, that I have seen in that time a decline.
Well, yeah, 30 years now in this era is so much is happening versus 30 years, 100 years ago, 1,000 years
fast,
ago.
Aren't they?
Yeah, they really are. Yeah. I want to get to that, where we can talk a little bit about the salmon out there. Maybe we could start off by, if you could tell people about your books, sort of chronologically and what they're about. And then I'd love to backtrack a little bit to how you got into this stuff.
Yeah, sure. So sort of going back to the early years, I moved up to Seattle to go to grad school at University of Washington in writing. And I finished up the program and didn't know what the heck I wanted to do. And I met my wife actually in the writing program. She's a poet, Martha Solano, and she teaches college, and I think she always wanted to teach, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I actually found myself, with my master's degree in hand, taking a bus to downtown Seattle and going to one of those employment agencies that places temp workers around town. And they took a look at my resume and they said, they were a little baffled by it, but they said, we think we can match you up with something. And it turned out they had a proofreading job for me over at the sort of nascent Microsoft.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. This is in the mid 1990s. Now I'd heard of Microsoft, as most people by then had, but yeah, it was a pretty easy job, because I had been a newspaper reporter and a copy editor and done some of those jobs. And so being a proofreader, didn't take too much. And I found that I had a lot of time at the end of the day after I was given all my tasks to kill. And there was a guy across the hall from me at work who was in an office by himself that was designed for 3. And he had switched out all the light bulbs, those nasty fluorescent ones, and replaced them with sort of comforting red and purple light bulbs.
I like this guy.
Bluegrass music was emanating out of his office. And I thought, I got to get to know this guy. So I would go over there and just check in with him and see what he was up to. And it turned out that he was taking all the material that I was proofreading And this was all material related to sort of movie trivia. For a CD-ROM, and I'm going to date myself here because I don't know how much of your audience even knows what a CD-ROM is.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
They had a CD-ROM called Cinemania, which was this movie-related CD-ROM. And basically, I was fact-checking all the Academy Awards going back to the 20s,
Okay.
And they would give me these big, thick reams of, the old-fashioned computer paper, the dot matrix with the holes in it, and I would proof them. And then send it to this guy across the hallway.
There are kids listening right now who they don't, it's not like they're not getting it, but they can't picture what you're talking about.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm really
it's
making
awesome.
myself
I love it.
Feel old.
It's not that long ago. It's just the pace of change is so dramatic.
I know. This would have been about 1995, I think.
Mm-hmm. This is just after the Clovis and Folsom people.
Well, exactly. And this was actually where I got my first email address. Okay. And anyway, he would take all this material and he would start putting codes around it. And that's when I first discovered what HTML was and the web browser and how you did all this how you put things on the web. And the web was brand new at this point. And I realized what they were doing was they were taking all this content from the CD-ROM Cinemania and putting it on a website. That's basically what we were there to do.
Yeah, neat.
Okay. So I just started hanging around helping him out. And before long, our boss said, why don't you stay in this office? And I was happy to do that. And that's when I first sort of learned some web production skills to match with the editorial skills that I already had. And, I just feel like I was kind of in the right place at the right time because those would prove to be good skills to have. And before long, I found myself back in Seattle working for this little online bookstore that you may have heard of. Back then, it only sold books, called Amazon.com.
This guy's so old.
I know. I feel like it's sort of a Zelig move, if anybody's ever seen that movie, Zelig. But yeah, I mean, there was just a sort of series of just fortunate events, and so I spent some time there, a number of years, in fact. And meanwhile, my wife was still, writing poetry and teaching college, and all of a sudden, one year she receives this award. It's a writing residency fellowship that involves caretaking a homestead off the grid in southwestern Oregon in the Rogue River Canyon. And it would mean, basically parachuting into the woods with my family. And at that point we had a 3-year-old son, and I would need to quit my job. And you know what? I was ready to at that moment, because this just seemed like an opportunity like no other.
Right.
To live off the grid, in a essentially de facto wilderness. I mean, we were surrounded by thousands of acres of public land.
Not literally parachuting, obviously.
We did not quite do that. Yeah. But I'll tell you what, when you drive the logging roads back in there to get to this place and you're looking over the precipice, you're kind of wishing maybe you had a parachute.
Right.
But we were about 2 hours from the nearest town, which was Grants Pass. And it was just an extraordinary place to spend a year. We had a garden the size of a hockey rink. There was an orchard on the property with all kinds of varieties of apples and pears and cherries and plums, even wine grapes. And then, of course, there was all sorts of foraging to be done. We were picking mushrooms and miner's lettuce and huckleberries and fishing for salmon and steelhead in the Rogue River.
Oh, no kidding. Now, did you have a background doing any of that, or was it new for you?
So, spending time in Seattle, I just kind of fell in with a group of foragers. In the Pacific Northwest, that's just something that people do. People go berry picking. They go clam digging. Of course, they go salmon fishing. They go mushroom hunting. These are just activities that, are pretty common in this region. Mm-hmm. And we think of them now as sort of things that our grandparents, knew how to do and that we're now rediscovering, in this age. But I think that foraging is something that Northwesterners really have always done.
Always, yeah.
Yeah. And so I can just remember, when I was in grad school at UW, I had classmates who I learned to do all kinds of things with. One guy I would go diving for crabs with. We would put on wetsuits and dive in Puget Sound for
free diving,
free diving for Dungeness crabs. And then we'd put on these great crab feeds and invite everybody in the department over. And of course, these are a bunch of starving grad students, and
right.
Suddenly they've got a mess of crabs and beer in front of them, and it's like, this is good action,
So
and
you'd already had that like thing where you connect the landscape, food from the landscape, and then the joy of sharing that food with people. That was already sort of built into you by the time you'd gone on this to this homestead.
By the time I went to the Rogue, it was sort of already there.
Yeah.
But there wasn't any sort of philosophy that I had built around it. It was just something that I had, enjoyed with my friends. And we went clam digging and oystering and mushroom hunting. And it was just something that you did with your friends. And of course you did it when you're out in the outback, especially if you were backpacking, because, when you're 20 miles from a trailhead, it's really nice to be able to bump up, the typical astronaut backpack food
right.
with something fresh from the wild. So if you can catch an alpine trout, if you can forage some morels, if you can pick huckleberries and feel safe and know what they are, then, you can suddenly turn what is, typically not such a great meal into something special.
Mm-hmm.
So this was something that I did, but, didn't think that much about it. And I wasn't writing about it at all during this period. And so there we were in Oregon. I'd quit my job. My wife took a sabbatical from her work. We were there with our 3-year-old, and we were far from civilization. We saw, during the months of July and August, we saw bears pretty much every day because we had a huge blackberry patch out by the cabin.
You'd see brown bears or black bears?
Just black bears. There are no grizzlies in Oregon.
Nice.
Okay. So just black bears, and they kind of knew who we were, and we never had any problems with them. They had plenty to eat, but they were not that far from us at times. Right. And sometimes my little boy would run out on the deck and yell at them, "Get bear!" They would run up a tree and hang out there and wait for us to go back in the cabin, But yeah, we saw cougar one day, and
wow.
we were just surrounded by wildlife, and there was nobody around because this is not a place that is filled with hiking trails. In fact, there are very few trails, but there is the river. The river is the main transportation artery through this area, the Rogue River.
Okay.
So there were lots of rafters going by kind of down below, about 800 vertical feet below us.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, we had a trail that led to the river that was about 3/4 of a mile long.
But steep.
And so, during the dog days of summer when the thermometer was in triple digits, we would pretty much go down to the Rogue every day and cool off with a nice swim. But of course, we were also, fishing for salmon and steelhead, and just enjoying being out there in the wild. Pretty much wherever we went, we were off trail bushwhacking around, and it's just a wonderful experience for a 3-year-old to have.
Mm-hmm.
He really kind of grew up just being surrounded by this incredible environment and learned all the birds and the animals. And he was doing exactly what I was doing at his age.
Right.
He was going outside, lifting up rocks and finding out, what was underneath, sometimes scorpions, and collecting these things for his little jars and hoping, to see the food chain in action,
right.
Little boys really want to see the, as he called it, the predator prey.
Yeah. Do you imagine going back to that? Do you sort of fantasize about going back to that life at all?
Oh, I think of it as really just the best year ever.
Yeah.
So
hard to cultivate that these days, but it's like so needed.
Yeah. We did become friends with the landowners who were associated with this writing residency, and so we do get invitations to go back. And in fact, I was there earlier this month, and it's just the sort of place that when you get back there, just you really slough off civilization and all the anxieties and cares that come with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you feel in some ways, and I'm sure this isn't true of everyone, but I feel like a sort of more truer version of myself when I'm out there.
I think that's true of most people. If you could, I appreciate you being sensitive for folks there, but I mean, some people don't know they need that, but I think it works for everybody.
Right. You have to shed a little bit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it was out in those woods that I really started writing about wild foods, somewhat by accident. I was maintaining a blog, which, this was the early days of blogging. That was probably a new word in the dictionary that year.
A little less pressure to have something out every single day.
Yeah. Oh, no. This was more like every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And we would go to town. And when I say off the grid, I mean, there was no electricity.
Mm-hmm.
There was no phone. We did have a satellite phone for emergency, but this was a cumbersome giant thing. And you had to go stand out in the meadow and triangulate some satellites in order to get reception. Right. It was very expensive to use. And so basically we would just turn it on so other people could reach us. Mm-hmm. And we had phone hours, a couple times a week when we would turn it on. And if there was an emergency and a family member needed to get a hold of us, they could. But really, that was it. We had a couple of solar panels that could charge a deep cycle battery, so you could charge a laptop, but the rest was propane lights and kerosene lights and propane stove and propane fridge and all of that. And so what I would do is, I was taking tons of photos and writing up these little vignettes of our adventures out there. And then every couple of weeks we would go to town and we'd stock up on some necessities and pick up our mail and things like that. And I would go to a coffee shop that had Wi-Fi and I would upload all this material into the blog. And that was sort of the way that we maintained contact with the outside world. Mm-hmm. Well, by the end of the year, I printed this thing out and it was several inches thick, just a ream of papers. And I realized that I had all this wonderful material. And, I'd always wanted to write, but of course other life events got in the way of that. And I'd wanted to write fiction, but I found that I could tell stories about our time off the grid and do it, with the same tools as a novelist and just have a lot of fun. And so I started crafting this material that I had into these essays. And that's when the foraging theme really announced itself. I just sort of realized a lot of what I was writing about was wild food and the adventures of learning how to find these wild foods and how to harvest them and how to prepare them in the kitchen. And it kind of combined, my love of natural history with this culinary side, which was something that was kind of developing with me. When I first met my wife, Martha, she comes from a Polish-Italian background, and those sort of food ways had really been instilled in her by her parents. And so I just really love being in the kitchen with her, cooking up these different Italian and Polish dishes, and hearing about her relatives and how she learned to cook these dishes. And that was when I really started getting into cooking. And then as I was foraging more, I found that it was sort of a tandem process of learning how to forage and learning how to cook these wild ingredients that were really so special. And it gives you a lot of motivation as a cook, right? When you have an ingredient that is your sort of star ingredient, even if it doesn't play the star role in the dish, but if it's something you harvested yourself, the treatment of that ingredient can really inspire the cooking process, I feel like. That's right. And you want to do it justice and respect,
right?
Because these are special ingredients, especially, if it's a fish or something that you've taken its life. You want to pay it the respect of nourishing yourself and your family with a dish that just knocks everyone out, you know? And so I really started getting into cooking. And of course, living off the grid and cooking is its own challenge. With a propane stove and all of that. And sometimes just cooking right on the wood stove, after in the colder months when that wood stove was going around the clock, we had to make sure our 3-year-old didn't get too close to it. That thing was hot,
Mm-hmm.
and we were cooking soups and stews just directly on the wood stove. But yeah, really making these wonderful dishes out in the woods with foods that we had found or grown ourselves, and writing about it. And when we left the woods at the end of that year, and came back to Seattle, it was also a way to preserve those memories, to start writing about it and just to relive it, because it was such a special, extraordinary year for me. And pretty soon I had a collection of pieces, and then I reached back into my memories, and realized, well, I've got all these adventures of like going out and picking morels with friends and going salmon fishing and, digging gooey ducks and things like that.
Describe a gooey duck to the listener again.
I know.
Assume somebody's been in Nebraska, or they're out in Michigan.
Right.
They've never seen
Well, a gooey duck is probably our most famous clam out here in Puget Sound. And, it had a less couth name that was given to it by the settlers, horse blank. but yeah, just imagine the most phallic critter that you can, and
like
they're giant.
Like a sloppy, dangly, semi-erect phallic.
Yes,
it looks like it came out of. It looks like you went to the sex shop and bought the biggest, nastiest.
Yes, it is.
And then stuck 2 little clamshells on the side of it. And you're like, well, what are the point of those? They don't even contain this thing.
The biggest one that I've ever dug was about 7 pounds. So
What?
Think about it. That's a lot of quivering flesh.
Wow, 7 pounds.
Well, they reach into double digits. And I've heard stories of people finding, 10, 12, 15-pound gooey
Is that
ducks.
whole thing edible? Aside from, I know if, we get soft shell and hard shell clams here, there's little parts you pull off, but is it largely edible?
It's mostly the siphon, and the entire siphon is edible. In fact, that's what's used for sashimi in sushi
But that's
bars.
that whole long phallic part.
That's the whole phallic part. And then there is the body meat, which is edible as well and delicious. And I find that the body meat is actually really great for Chinese style stir fry.
Okay.
Yeah.
But so one good sized gooey duck is like that's a full meal. Like a 7-pound one would feed a couple of people.
Yeah, more than that. Yeah. Like a 7-pound gooey duck is like for a party, because there's only so much clam that you can really feed.
Right. Exactly. That's what I'm thinking too.
But that makes a ton of sashimi. You're slicing that fairly thin. Yeah.
Yeah. And is the siphon it's got like a it's hollow in the middle. It's
a double siphon. So it siphons in and then it expels.
Okay,
right?
so when you slice
it's like a double barrel shotgun.
Okay, you slice it for sashimi, and you've got like 2 little.
You butterfly that, and so it actually at that point there are you've butterflied it, and so it's kind of laying down flat at that point. Yeah, and then you just slice it on the profile. Fairly thin. Yeah.
All right.
And
anyway, sorry, I didn't
it's
mean to
delicious.
pull you off.
If you like clams. If you like clams, and I grew up, as I mentioned, in New England, and I can remember eating my first soft-shell clams and just being like, whoa, where have these been all my life?
Right,
and I would always get clams after that. But a gooey duck is the clammiest clam that you've ever experienced.
Clam flavory clammed?
Yes. It
looks like it would be. It would have to be.
And the other thing is it's very al dente. So it has that kind of resisting the tooth aspect to its texture.
Do people pound it at all or to tenderize it or anything?
You really don't need to. Just slicing it thin for sashimi is the way to go. And then, you can use it for whatever.
I really hope people
it's kind of wasted on chowder. But
I hope people take a minute to look this thing up, because I'll occasionally just at a party or something be like, have you guys heard of this? And then I love pulling up the Google image of it because people are blown away that this thing even exists.
Yeah, and most people mispronounce it when they haven't, heard of it before. They think it's a geoduck.
Yes,
but the way it's pronounced is gooey duck, which actually is a term that's sort of bastardized from the Nisqually tribe, which is a sort of southern Puget Sound, and they're part of the Salish language group. And gooey duck meant dig deep. And that is a very good description, because you have to dig a trench like 3 or 4 feet deep to get one of these things out of the ground.
Oh, they're down in there. Okay, because like our soft shell clams, they're like 6 inches under the ground. It's very easy to get at them,
Oh, no. These things are way down there. And, they're a burrowing clam, but once they've burrowed down to where they're going to be, that's it. So they can't dig at all, unlike, say, a razor clam. So they're under there. And they're kind of suctioned in, there's sort of a vacuum there. So that can be tough. You have to break that vacuum. But first, what you have to do is you just have to dig a really deep hole. And there are a lot of different methods for going about this. But my favorite method is to use the bank heist method, which, imagine the old movies where like the bank robbers, rent the old candy store next door to the bank. And then during the night, they're tunneling down and then across into the vault, right? So that's how we do it. So we sort of dig a deep hole parallel to where the clam is.
You know where the clam is because you see a little vent in the surface.
Well, you have to find the siphon's little, where it reaches to the surface.
Little lumen.
And you can only go on the lowest tides of the year. So this is typically around the solstice.
Okay. I would say need an alignment of sun and earth for gravitational reasons.
That's right. Those are the lowest tides. We need basically a negative 3 foot tide.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so you get those lowest tides kind of
they're
May,
deep,
June,
but they're also
early.
fairly far out to where the tide lines are.
That's right. In fact, they're all the way out in the middle of Puget Sound. There have been studies that suggest that they represent the highest biomass in Puget Sound.
No.
Yeah. There are a lot of gooey ducks out there.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And most of the ones that are commercially harvested are going to Japan.
Okay. But they don't have a method like dragging or anything. There's no.
No, they use what's called a stinger. And a stinger is just a guy will put on one of those wetsuits that you see in the cartoons where he walks around on the bottom with this sort of helmet.
Face.
And yeah, exactly. And uses this thing called a stinger, which is just high pressured water out of a nozzle.
Okay.
And he basically blasts them out of their holes.
Whoa.
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah. But for the rest of us, we got to dig them.
Yeah.
And we have to do it when the tide is at its lowest. And of course, you're racing the tide too. So there's that element. And I have been thwarted by a tide that turned and came back in, and we just couldn't get the gooey duck out of the ground before we were in 3 foot of water. Yeah.
You're so lucky, right? So lucky.
I mean, it's really, it's actually, for a clam that's just sort of immovable and stuck in the ground, it's pretty exciting stuff.
I was going to say, as you're describing it, making the WildFed show, we've had people say to us, and one of my favorite pieces of feedback is like, I didn't realize foraging could be exciting or an adventure. And I'm like, oh, yeah, it is. Especially, some of the episodes where people have really seen that is like when we go wild ricing, for instance, things like that, where you really see that there's, you need a canoe and you need these tools and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But clamming is something that, because one of my big hopes is that I want to see like more of an integration between the foraging world, the fishing world, the hunting world, like all coming together a little, all those wild food disciplines kind of being under an umbrella.
We're all in this together.
Yeah. And we have all these complementary skills and we're doing such similar things, but I feel like there's a lot of little camps. And so, clamming is one of those things that I think a lot of traditional hunters do, but a lot of like modern sporting hunters might not do, not realizing how much fun they can have.
Yeah, well, you really need to get out here because this has got to be one of the clamming capitals of the world, I would think. And, we have another type of clam that's absolutely delicious called the razor clam. And razor clam culture in Washington is just something to behold. When they have razor clam openings, which typically start around now, and then will go through the winter into the spring, and, Fish and Wildlife, they manage it very carefully because at one time it got overfished. But the populations are back to good quantities. And what they'll do is that's another clam that you need a pretty low tide for. And this is a clam that we're going to the ocean beaches, so the sandy ocean beaches to dig. And unlike the gooey duck, the razor clams they have a very strong foot, and they can dig themselves to safety. So
while you're digging them?
Yes.
Wow.
So more than once I've seen somebody reach in, and they're fairly far down there too, often, 12, 18 inches. Okay. And I've seen someone, reach their arm down into a hole right up to the shoulder, trying to grab one and miss it, and just the clam is gone.
And they're real. They're so streamlined too, right? They're like sort of dart
Totally.
shaped, so they must move fairly
they,
slick
they,
through the sand.
They do. They're fast, and
Wow!
I think I read somewhere maybe they dig about an inch a second or something like that.
Oh my gosh! No kidding.
Yeah, and so don't let
Because
anybody
most clams
tell
are
you.
immobile, right? I mean, they spend. I know with like our soft shell clams, for instance, they just spend their life right wherever
That's right,
their
where they
larvae
are.
are landed. You
Hmm.
know.
Yep. Nope. Razor clams can dig, and so don't let anybody tell you it's not fair chase, right? And they're another just delicious clam.
Okay.
Great for clam chowder. We also make pasta sauces with them, and I'll have them as ceviche, which I do with the gooey duck as well.
Okay.
And so, but we do live in a great clamming area, and then all around Puget Sound, we're just loaded with Manila clams.
Oh, I don't know what that is. Tell me about that.
So the
Yeah,
Manila
Google that.
clam is actually a non-native species that came over from Japan many years ago, probably in ship ballast or something like that, and established itself here. Really likes Puget Sound because we have another clam that looks almost identical that we just call the native little neck clam. So they're both little necks, and like a gooey duck or a razor clam, they have a double siphon for inhaling and exhaling, but the neck is very short, hence the name little neck. And so that means that, they're going to be right below the surface.
Right.
So they're
Can you
great.
describe for people who don't, let's say somebody is not really aware of what this siphon does, how a clam works, how it filter feeds, and how it reveals itself to you.
Sure.
This could be a little confusing, this idea of the clam neck / vent. Explain all that for people. We'll get right back to the show in a moment, but first, you've got to try the wild rice from wildfoodwarehouse.com. Wild Food Warehouse is run by my personal friend Ben Belty, a forager and wild ricer who's brought Minnesota's wild rice to the marketplace. Now, even if you don't live or forage in a place where wild rice grows, you can still enjoy this incredible, wild, gluten-free grain. Price breaks on Wild Food Warehouse's wild rice start at £5, and the coupon code WildFed gets you an additional 10% off your order. Winter is coming, and it's time to stock your pantry. Get yourself some of North America's staple wild grain. It's all wild crafted right here in the USA, following Minnesota's strict ricing laws. I just ate I just ate 2 bowls of wild rice for lunch today. I added a little olive oil, shoyu, crushed garlic, and lemon juice. It is so good. But no matter how you eat it, wild rice is always delicious. If you've only ever tried the store-bought or restaurant ingredient we call quote-unquote wild rice, then you have to try the real thing. It's soft and nutty, and it's so good for you too. Again, go over to wildfoodwarehouse.com and use the coupon code WildFed to get 10% off your order. Remember, price breaks start at £5, so stock up now before the 2020 crop sells out. Next time you're savoring a bowl of wild rice, you'll be really glad you did. Again, it's wildfoodwarehouse.com, and the coupon code is WildFed. Now, back to the show.
So with the little neck clam, imagine it maybe 3 or 4 inches beneath the substrate, and it just sits there. It doesn't ever move, and its neck, what we call the neck, the siphon, extends out of the top of the double sort of clamshell to basically filter, phytoplankton and things like that. And essentially it goes right to the surface, so that when the tide goes out and it retracts its neck, because now there's no water covering it, right? And it's just sort of a few inches below the beach. You can see where its siphon was, and it leaves what we call the show. And the show is usually just a little dimple of some sort, and each clam has a different show, all right? So a gooey duck will have a show that's maybe the size of a $50 coin.
Oh my gosh,
yeah,
man.
It's a big.
Oh
and actually,
my gosh.
you can tell the size of a gooey duck by the size of its show.
Okay.
And often the gooey duck siphon will be visible kind of down in the show, and you can touch it.
Will he retract right away when you do that?
Yes, he will, but it's a kind of a clammy, weird, rubbery thing that you touch. I love when I take my students out. I just love having them touch it, and then it retracts. And it's just creepy.
Yeah.
But what's good about that is there's another clam similar to the gooey duck called a horse clam. That sometimes you can mistake the two, but if you feel the tip of their siphon, that's one way to ID the difference, because
What do you feel?
the horse clam will often have little bits of like shell and rock and other barnacles and things like that at the tip of its siphon, whereas the gooey ducks will be totally smooth and rubbery.
Why does he have that? Do you know?
It's just part of their ecology.
Yeah, I'm looking
I
at
really
pictures
don't know.
as you tell me about
It's
it.
almost like a beak with
Yep.
the horse clam.
Right. Okay. Not a
so
huge clam though, huh?
Oh, they're both big clams. Horse clams are great for chowder. And I think that the gooey duck is just considered a somewhat more gourmet clam, especially if you're going to do something like sashimi or ceviche, where you're going to eat it raw, essentially.
So I want to ask you real quick, because we kind of got off track of where we were, sort of getting to
That's
the
okay. I love rambling out.
I like
threads.
this too. But so you're bringing students out to Puget Sound as well, and leading like a sort of clamming or shellfishing classes?
That's right. Well, as I mentioned, it's been sort of one accident after another through my career. And, when I first got out of grad school, I had no interest in teaching, but now I find that I love teaching. But I'm doing a different sort of teaching. And I do teach writing workshops and things like that. But most of my teaching centers around taking students out into the woods or, to the coastline and teaching them foraging and wild food skills.
You're big into mushrooms too, aren't you? I'm looking at your Instagram account. Obviously, you wrote that book, The Mushroom Hunters, I believe is the title.
That's what I've been up to lately.
Okay.
We're in full tilt mushroom season right now.
Talk to me about what are the species that you get most excited about?
Well, the fall is the time for the diversity of species. In the spring, it's all about morels. And I love morel hunting, and I'm sure you probably have done some morel hunting.
Yeah, but you guys on the West Coast, morels here are pretty rare to find and very exciting when you do, but we just don't have that morel culture that you find as you start heading west.
Right. Well, you have pretty good morel culture in the upper Midwest. In fact, I've spent some time in places like Michigan and elsewhere where they have morel festivals
too. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But those are what we would call naturals. And those are morels that you would find in the same patch of woods year after year, because the habitat conditions are right, and the morels like those woods. And you generally need to have the right sort of tree canopy because they prefer certain trees over others. And so you can go back to those woods year after year and hopefully find morels, maybe not in the exact same spots, but in that general, patch of woods. Out here in the West, we have naturals as well, but we also have a type of morel that we call burn morels or fire morels. Mm-hmm. And these are morels that pop up in the spring following forest fires. And of course, forest fire is just part of our ecology out here in the West.
Crucial part of your ecology.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit more in the news right now than is good, because the fires are getting hotter and worse now for a variety of reasons. And so we've got problems with our forest fires. But what people don't realize is that forest fires are natural.
Some of your trees are actually adapted to seed dispersal in the presence of fire, right? So it's like, it's not a thing you want to go away completely. It's a thing that you want to have managed and maybe not out of control, but it's like some of the pines, right?
Exactly. Like a lodgepole pine, for instance,
Right.
Its seeds are not going to germinate unless, exposed to heat, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So we have an entire landscape that, has a fire ecology, and these morels have evolved in this landscape, and they're kind of mysterious, and mycologists don't fully understand what's going on, but for whatever reason, following these sort of montane forest fires, we can have these stupendous flushes of morels. And I think that's probably what you were referring to when you said it's a little different out here.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you see the pictures, and I know that morel hunters in other parts of the country just see this and kind of salivate because it really seems impossible.
I remember I was out west once. I was taking a workshop with the herbalist Stephen Harrod Buhner, and I'd met this girl in the workshop, and I ran into her on the streets. I think it was in Victoria I was in Vancouver Island, Victoria, in Vancouver
right.
Island. Bump into her on the street, and she's got a 5-gallon bucket filled with morels. She's going around to restaurants and stuff. And I'm just like, how can you find that many?
Yeah.
It's not, that wouldn't happen out here,
Yeah. Well, that's kind of standard fair there. I mean, when I was writing the book, The Mushroom Hunters, those guys out there, the professional pickers, I mean, they're hoping to score 100 pounds a day, which just seems inconceivable to someone who might be used to picking a half dozen, and being happy about that.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. If I found 6, I would be like my best find out here.
Right, right. It's like, woohoo, we're eating large tonight, Yeah. So it's really fun. And it is a bit of an embarrassment of riches.
Yeah.
And you can develop the kind of the mushroom greed, which is what I write about in the book, which is a debilitating state. And
summarize the book a little bit for us if you could.
Yeah. So we got off on the clamming topic and we were talking about it, but just to sort of go back to that, I started realizing not just that I had material from when we lived off the grid, but I had all these stories to tell about just foraging adventures with my friends back in the Seattle area. And that's how the book kind of came together. And then the kicker, which is what really sold it to the publisher, was adding a recipe for each chapter.
Are we talking about Fat of the Land, or are we talking?
We're talking about Fat of the Land.
Okay, so your first book. So give people the title. I've been trying to get you to do this for a minute.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm just kind of going off here.
Yeah, no, you're doing great, but I just want to get people to know about. I'm trying to plug you here.
I know. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so the first book is called Fat of the Land: Adventures of a 21st Century Forager. Mm-hmm. And in its finished version, it actually only has 2 chapters that take place in the Rogue River Canyon where we were living off the grid. Everything else is just from memory, of going out and having wild foraging adventures with my friends, really all over the Northwest. So mostly in Washington, but I think probably also in Oregon as well. And everything from diving for crabs to going squid jigging off a town pier right in downtown Seattle in the middle of the night, and getting stinging nettles and huckleberries and mushrooms and fishing for salmon. So both sort of traditional items that we think of as foraging, like mushrooms and wild greens, but also finned fish as well.
Yeah.
And clamming. And so, it's 15 chapters. Each one is on a different wild food that you could find in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere. There are a few that are specific to my region, but quite a few that you could find anywhere in North America. And then each chapter ends with a recipe. But, the thing that I realized when I was working on the book was that, okay, these foods are great characters in themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they are like characters. They have so much personality, and their life histories are fascinating, and they're obviously great food sources. But the people who are out there gathering these foods are equally great characters.
Fascinating. Yeah.
And so I kind of married the two. So, while you can learn a lot about each of the food items in the book, how to find it, how to process it, how to cook it, its natural history, all that sort of information, it's also equally a story. I want to make it entertaining. So it's not just for someone who wants to be a forager. It's also
not
for
a
somebody.
Field guide.
It's not a field guide. And if there's, somebody out there who's listening right now who just wants to be an armchair forager, hey, this is great off-season reading.
Yeah, totally.
Because I try and put the reader out there, with me on these adventures.
Is that book on Audible as well? I know your other 2 are.
I just found out if it isn't yet available, it's in process.
Okay, because the other 2 are both available as audiobook as well.
Yeah, and so Fat of the Land will be if it's not already. Yeah, so that's exciting. So that book actually led directly to the next book, The Mushroom Hunters. There's a chapter in Fat of the Land about picking fire morels. And I mentioned a few minutes ago about how, sometimes you can kind of get a little greedy because all of a sudden you're finding all these morels and you might be out there with some friends and you're kind of wondering how they're doing and if they're in the honey hole and you're not, and keeping tabs on each other and all of that. And, I talk about the mushroom greed and what a debilitating state that is because as you mentioned before, we're all in this together and, share and share alike and all of that. But things happen in the mushroom patch.
And people
sometimes.
get competitive.
People get competitive. And so I kind of write about that in sort of a humorous way. But in that chapter, there's a moment where we run into a couple of commercial pickers, and we're standing in a clearing. We're covered in soot, and ash from the burn. And, these fire-scarred landscapes are kind of beautiful in their own way.
Haunting.
And you can see the regeneration of nature happening right before your eyes. Because already, like, the fireweed is blooming. That's one of the first plants that comes up after a burn. And little, there are little insects and things that are coming back and repopulating this landscape. And so you can see the land starting to regenerate, right? Just right before your eyes. And so anyway, we're out there, and across this clearing, these two guys emerge, and they're each with huge packs on, and we can tell that they each have about 80 pounds of morels.
You're thinking about me.
And it's just, and here we are with like our woven Guatemalan baskets, with each about 5 pounds, and, traipsing through the woods, la-di-da, and we think we're pretty special. And then we see these guys, and it's like, wow, what have these guys done to just completely unlock nature's secrets? Right, and find 80 pounds of mushrooms apiece. It just seems incredible. And then just like that, no sooner had we seen them than they sort of turned on their heels and disappeared back into the woods. It was like a Bigfoot sighting. But I knew that they were commercial pickers. And that was the germination of the next book.
Oh, okay,
chapter.
Got it.
Yeah, I thought I need to figure out how these guys, how they do it, And so basically what happened next was I had to worm my way into that culture. And, the subtitle of the book it's called The Mushroom Hunters, and the subtitle is On the Trail of an Underground America.
Yeah.
And that's really true because, for one thing, the wild mushroom business, you might not realize this, is the largest all cash business in North America.
Wow.
That's legal.
Yeah.
Little caveat there. So it's actually, it's kind of big money, but nobody really even realizes it exists.
Restaurants and specialty markets are the outlets primarily?
That's right. They are the end of the pipeline. And so basically it's pickers fan out into the woods. They pick the wild mushrooms. They sell them to field buyers who set up their little buy stands in these out-of-the-way corners of national forests and places like that, on the side of a logging road. And then the field buyers, by the end of the day, and they might show up at their station with $5,000 in cash,
Wow.
And probably a pistol as well.
Yeah.
And they'll pay out, all of their boss's cash to the pickers, weigh out the mushrooms and box them up and bring them to the warehouse. And then from there, maybe they get sold to another middleman, or from there they go directly to the restaurants. And of course, speed is of the utmost importance at this point. And
where are they keeping them in? Are they using paper bags? Are they on open trays? Like,
well, they're in these plastic. They're in these plastic baskets that are sort of like produce baskets.
Okay.
And it's a standardized thing, and the baskets have lids to them. And
are they breathable on the sides?
They can be stacked. Yes, they're breathable.
Got it.
And they go into a walk-in cooler, when they get to the warehouse. But before that, they're in the back of a van or something.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they're in the picker's car.
Yeah.
Anyway, by the time they get to the warehouse, they get sorted and boxed up, and then they get mailed out. Sometimes airmailed across the country to restaurants. And, primarily they're going to restaurants, although they're also going to specialty food markets and farmers markets and things like that. But I
have this little joke. I mean, listeners are probably sick of hearing me say this, and I probably piss people off a little with it. And I'm painting ultra broad brushstrokes and being, I'm
I'm stereotyping a lot here, but I like to kind of joke about the different cultures of wild food people, because you've got hunters and you've got fishers and you've got foragers, and then you got the mushroom people, you know?
Yeah, the
And
mushroom people are different, aren't they?
they are really different. Now,
Yeah.
one of the things I'll say about them is I think that they tend to, obviously I'm, again, really broad brush strokes, but there tends to be a higher mean or average IQ, I'd say, because, or at least in my experience, because you don't have a lot of, poisonous lookalike trout. There's no poisonous lookalike deer.
Mm-hmm.
You get into more with plants, but when you start getting into mushrooms, a lot of these species are, you need to be able to communicate their Latin names. You need to be able to differentiate. They're very ephemeral. And so, there tends to be conversation that goes on at a very high level, even amongst the average. Like your average forager isn't necessarily a botanist, but your average mushroom person tends to be able to communicate mycology at a some sort of surprisingly high level often.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right, that's what I was curious. Do you agree with that? And sort of, how do you characterize? I've upset some mushroom people before by saying sort of like they're the strangest of all, like they're the sort of most. And I think the other weird thing with the mushroom culture is that botany, just because somebody's a botanist doesn't mean they've encountered psychedelic plants, but mushroom people have a much higher tendency to have encountered psychedelic mushrooms in their lifetime than I would say your average botanist hasn't done ayahuasca, but your average mushroomer's probably messed around with some psychedelic mushrooms before,
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Out here in the Northwest, which is really kind of the center of this trade, although it's happening all across the country, just because we're in a, famously wet place. And then we have these big conifer forests. And so while you might have more diversity, say, on the East Coast with all these different deciduous trees, and for the listeners, I should mention, these mushrooms have relationships with trees. So I often tell my students, if you want to learn about mushrooms, learn your trees first.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So you can, if you go out looking for as many different species as you can, well, if you're walking through some Appalachian woods with a lot of different hardwoods, you'll probably find more species. But out where I live, with these big conifer forests where maybe there's only 3 different species of tree, you're maybe not finding the diversity, but you're finding the numbers, and you're finding the numbers of especially the edibles. And so whether it's chanterelles or porcini or hedgehogs or black trumpets or, the list goes on, this is really the place to find large quantities of edible mushrooms. And there is a whole kind of culture, but it's a secretive culture. Mm-hmm. People have these mushroom patches that they visit year after year, and they're like portfolios. As one of the pickers in my book refers to it, he calls them like stock portfolios. And you got to have a diversified portfolio, and because you need to have your early season patches, you need to have your late season patches, you need to have your high elevation patches and your low elevation patches, and then of course you have to have all the different species, right? And so they have just, they've forgotten more patches over the course of their careers than I have patches in my entire history of picking mushrooms.
What's a successful mushroom forager, commercial mushroom forager's annual income from that activity look like, do you think?
It's not great.
Good to know.
It's not. So the other phenomenon that we have out here that perhaps, and I don't know if you have this in the Maine woods or not, but we had in the sort of 80s, early 90s, a lot of basically refugees from the wars in Southeast Asia settled up and down the West Coast. And you can imagine, you arrive in this country, you don't speak the language, but you have skills, you're comfortable in the woods, and you can find mushrooms, This is a great way to make some money, as you're sort of learning your way around a new country.
I haven't seen this in the commercial foraging world. Okay.
Oh, big time. Yeah. Okay. And same thing with, what sometimes is called the apple trail, or, basically the migration out of Mexico and Central America for fruit picking and things like that.
Right.
Well, imagine you're bent over in a strawberry patch in California, doing backbreaking work for hours, and somebody, elbows you and says, take a look over there, towards the misty mountains, right? You could be up there, picking mushrooms and be your own boss and just ramble around the woods instead of being bent over in this strawberry patch,
right.
So, I mean, it's certainly attractive to somebody who just wants to be their own boss, and be, maybe on their own out in the woods. You definitely get quite a few iconoclasts, social misfits. It's the sort of occupation that maybe attracted Vietnam vets, people like that.
But it's not like hippies and anarchists and stuff.
It's not just hip. Well, that's sort of a more recent group that's sort of, hoved in on it. The original pickers were out of work loggers. Yeah. And that would have been, in the 70s and 80s. And that's really when this all began. You didn't really have the infrastructure before that. Before probably the 70s, you might have the backdoor forager, who would come to a restaurant and say, hey, I got a basket of some stuff, you want to buy it? And that would happen all over the country. But that grew into a big business here in the Northwest with the mushroom patches.
Okay. And now American cuisine has changed so much too, where it's like a sort of a feature of nearly any modern American restaurant to see foraged mushrooms in the menu.
If you're a Michelin aspiring chef, you're going to have some wild foods on your menu.
Yeah.
That's just the way it is. And so, right, all of this kind of happened together in concert. But, overall, I would say it's not a great way to make a living. It's really hard. It's, as you put it, the product is ephemeral. It's this fleeting product. So you have to really work efficiently, quickly, and then move on. And so you're traveling, and you're basically roaming what we call the mushroom trail. And you're following the flushes of mushrooms, essentially from Southeast Alaska down to Northern California, and maybe as far east as Western Montana.
Okay. But are people making, can they make, is it like salmon fishing or something where you make a whack of money in the summer and then the rest of the year you're doing something else? And what kind of money's changing hands?
In a way, it is like salmon fishing, except salmon fishing is a pretty set season every year where you go up to Alaska, say, and in 2 months you make a bunch of money, and then, you go and hang out on the beach in Belize and try and conserve as much of it as possible. Yeah. With mushroom picking, it's actually a year in that area that I just mentioned, from Southeast Alaska down to Northern California now to Montana. If you draw a circle around that area, that's essentially the mushroom trail. And every day out of the year, there are wild mushrooms that are fruiting in that circle. Okay. Right now, the pickers are moving south. They've probably left Washington at this point because we've really had a cold snap at this point, and a lot of the mushrooms are kind of done, except at sea level. And so they're moving into Oregon and down towards Northern California. And by Thanksgiving, it's really southwestern Oregon and Northern California. And the pickers will do what they call winter pick in that area until, maybe April when the morels start popping. And then once the morels are popping in the spring, they will follow the flushes back north, perhaps all the way up to BC or even Alaska.
Wow.
Of course, not this year because they can't get into Canada. But yeah, sadly, one of the byproducts of all the terrible wildfires that we've been having, especially in California and Oregon, will be huge morel flushes.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I can imagine that there are pickers right now
very excited about the spring,
who are excited, and, they're preparing.
Yeah. Right.
They know where the burns are. Maybe they've done a little footwork already, and then in the spring, they'll go scout these burns, even if there's still snow. What they want to see is they want to see the tree canopy, what type of trees there are, because, some mixes of trees are better than others. Mm-hmm. And they want to see what the ground looks like, and what the accessibility is. Are there roads that go up into the burn, logging roads, that sort of thing? Are there hiking trails? Is there town nearby where they can get supplies? Is there a place to camp? These are all factors that weigh in. And maybe they'll set up a little spike camp in the wilderness, and spend days there before hauling out, their morels. Of course, that poses its own problems because you have to get the morels to the buyers pretty quickly because, as I mentioned, they're a fleeting product. And so really you don't want to be holding on to them for very long. And if you do have to hold on to them because of the nature of maybe where you're camped, then what you would do is you'd locate a little creek bottom, which is going to be maybe 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding area.
Oh, yeah.
And you stash all your baskets down
There's
in the
microclimates.
creek. Yeah, right down in the bushes by the creek,
Yeah.
But those are all the factors that go into it. I mean, you really have to be kind of in touch with your senses and your sense of woodcraft and the natural environment.
Yeah, and I'm curious now that there's some time that's gone by. You've got another book out now. Some time has passed. When you look at the commercial mushroom foraging world, now, I mean, as I understand it, probably compared to fisheries, compared to mammals, that it's probably one of the most sustainable takes. But like, where are we at in both ecological sustainability, in regulation, in overall sort of conservation when it comes to commercial mushroom foraging? And then what's it going to look like if you look at, you shake your magic 8-ball, like what's the future look like for commercial mushroom foraging?
Those are great questions, and they're questions that I always get whenever I give these lectures about the mushroom scene and talk about my book. So the latest thinking is, and this is all subject to change because mycology is a pretty fast-moving discipline right now.
Yeah.
Mushroom names, the Latin names are changing all the time because just through DNA work, we're realizing that certain species, we thought we knew what they were and they're different,
Well, it's such an still unexplored, discipline as well. I mean, it seems like there's still, you could become a mycologist and name species to science still, right?
You could have a mushroom named after you potentially. Mm-hmm. That's how, right. I mean, there are still plenty of mushrooms left to be named. It's underfunded at the university level. There just aren't a lot of mycologists out there. So we need to do more study because, as you've probably heard, there are a lot of people evangelizing mushrooms out there who really think that mushrooms could solve some of our big sort of civilizational problems. For instance, we've discovered that we can use oyster mushrooms to help clean up oil spills.
So
mushrooms will literally eat the oil,
Yeah, and then what's cool about them is that once they have done that, it's not like they're contaminated with oil. They've deconstructed the oil and then reconstructed those carbon chains into mushroom flesh.
It's amazing how they do this. And they found that, like, for instance, with the nuclear fallout from Chernobyl, that it's really the fungi that have helped kind of cleanse that fallout from the landscape.
Oh, that's amazing.
Now, I probably wouldn't want to eat those mushrooms.
Not those ones.
But you're right. I mean, eventually that stuff is just somehow going away, and we don't even fully understand that process. But back to what you were saying about the sustainability, because that's really important. The analogy that you often hear is that picking mushrooms is like picking cherries from a tree. As long as you don't damage the tree, or cut it down, then you can go back to that tree year after year and pick cherries, because the mushroom is just the fruiting body of the fungus. The mushroom has no problem spreading its spores. Okay.
Even while they're in your basket walking out of the woods.
Exactly. And we're picking just a fraction of the mushrooms that are out there. The sense that I get from talking with people who know more about these issues is that mushroom hunting as it exists right now is totally sustainable, that we're hardly putting a dent in the population of mushrooms. It's not so much the quantity of the harvest, it's really how we behave when we're out in the woods. So just leave a light, footprint behind, right? Yeah. Don't leave trash behind. Don't dig around. For instance, take truffles, which are a really highly prized type of fungi that live underground, and they need to be dug up. Well, most of the truffle hunters these days are going out there with dogs, because the dog has a smeller that's like 10,000 times stronger than our own noses.
Right.
And so the dog that's been trained can find the truffle 99% of the time. I've been out with dogs before. It's really amazing to watch them work in the woods. And so then once the dog is sort of pointed, as it does, the truffle, then you just can take your little scoop or whatever and dig a little hole and get the truffle, rather than, say, going out with rakes the way it used to be done and just kind of indiscriminately raking the forest floor and tearing up the roots of the trees and all of that. It can be done in a much more sustainable way.
Where have you done that, by the way, with dogs?
I've done it in both Washington and Oregon,
okay.
Which is really where most of the truffle, where the native truffle harvest is.
Okay.
We have white truffles, and we have white truffles and black truffles, just like in Europe.
Okay.
And our truffles seem to be mycorrhizal, which is a term of art from mycology, which means they have a symbiotic relationship with Douglas firs.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. And so our native truffles, really the center of it is probably the Willamette Valley down in Oregon. But there are truffles, from southern BC all the way down into northern California, and probably elsewhere. They're probably in Idaho and other places, wherever there are Douglas fir trees.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but they are, as opposed to being a fruiting body, they're a sclerotial body, right? They're like a storage organ, like a chaga would be.
So another word here is hypogous, which means underground. So they're just a type of fungus that grows underground. Are they just sclerotial? I'm not sure.
But they're not.
I think the truffle is
the fruit body.
I think the truffle is the final form of it, though. So maybe it is the fruiting body.
Okay.
That's a question I haven't gotten before. I'll have to dig. I mean, they would seem sclerotial, wouldn't they?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it would seem. Because
they're like little nuggets of coal underground.
Right. Pretty hard too, right? I mean, you take it to a grater.
Yeah, that's right. You use a grater, and basically what the culinary folks are after, what diners are after, is the aroma. Mm-hmm. It's the aroma of the truffle. And it's funny because some of us are really hardwired to just be bowled over by that aroma. And for other people, it just leaves them cold. Like they don't notice it at all. I would say I'm somewhere in the middle. Like I appreciate a good truffle. I enjoy that. But I know people who just go to pieces when confronted.
What are they paying for one?
I mean, astronomical amounts, but they don't weigh very much.
Mm-hmm.
The most I ever paid for a truffle was in a restaurant in San Francisco when Alba white truffles from Italy were ripe. It was in the fall, and they imported them. And this is probably the most desirable truffle in the world.
Okay.
And I just remember the waiter coming tableside, and we ordered very simple pastas. It was sort of like an Alfredo type of pasta, with a creamy butter sauce. And then the waiter came and he weighed the truffle, and then he shaved it over each of our dishes, and then he weighed it again. And then the difference, was multiplied by X, and X seemed to be a lot because I think we each paid an additional $20.
For those flakes. I'm like wounded from that fake truffle oil. That stuff is such a.
The truffle oil is a sham.
Yeah,
that's just
chemical, right?
That's just been concocted in some chemical plant in New Jersey or somewhere.
Right.
It's strictly just molecules.
Did I hear you talking on a podcast about doing some mushrooming in China, maybe?
I have been to China. I actually went to China to do research for my book, The Mushroom Hunters, because initially I kind of saw a more global approach, but eventually over time I realized that what I really wanted to tell was the American side of the story.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is that we're in our infancy here in North America in terms of the mushroom trade, whereas in places like China, Italy, Eastern Europe, they have a much more developed mushroom culture. In China, it's been around for thousands of years. So I went to this farmer's market in a place called Kanding, which is kind of it's sort of in the foothills of the Himalayas, and it's in Sichuan province, heading up to the Tibetan plateau. And I think we were at about 10,000 feet, if I recall. And there was this town that, it probably would have been the equivalent of, imagine like a mountain ski town, in North America, a small mountain town. Okay. And they had a farmer's market there that was just unbelievable, that went on for, multiple football fields, hundreds and hundreds of yards long, and part of it was just devoted to wild mushrooms. They had wild mushroom stalls, maybe there were dozens of them that, just in their own right constituted what would have been like considered a pretty big farmer's market here in the US.
Oh, wow.
And they had everything, all kinds of species that I was not used to seeing being bought and sold. And it was really just fun checking this out. And then we actually did a lot of mushroom hunting up on the Tibetan Plateau, and just kind of roamed around, went to various villages and had mushroom dinners wherever we went. In one case, we met some matsutake pickers up in some higher mountain areas, just in these lush forests that were filled with, I can remember, it wasn't, these weren't forests like what I was used to. These were more deciduous forests and filled with rhododendron and just beautiful
neat.
Forests.
Yeah.
And we ran into these matsutake pickers, and we bought some matsutake from them because we were having a hard time finding them ourselves. And we brought them to a restaurant, and we asked them to cook us up a soup with the matsutake mushrooms. And the cook came out, and there was none of us could speak Chinese, and they couldn't speak English. But we had enough of a conversation where a little piece of paper was handed over, and we signed, somebody signed their name on the dotted line, which basically freed up the chef of all liability.
Yeah. How do they compare with the American matsutake?
So, 90% of the American matsutake is shipped over to Japan, where they it's their favorite mushroom. And this is the time of year for matsutake. And they refer to the sort of the very unique odor of matsutake as autumn aroma.
Neat.
And it's really prized. And actually, David Aurora, the American mycologist, has a great description of that aroma. He calls it a provocative combination of red hots and dirty socks.
Yeah.
Which I really think describes it, because the mushrooms have this sort of cinnamony spiciness,
pepperiness,
but also this funky, fungally, mushroomy thing going on.
Yeah, right.
And it's not for everybody. I know a lot of people who don't care for matsutake, but it's very prized in Japan, and about 90% of our matsutake goes to Japan, and probably most of it's picked in Oregon.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, I have a whole chapter in the book where I go and I camp with the pickers in Central Oregon, in the Cascades. And it's just huge volumes of matsutake are coming out of there. But there are other places as well. There's a lot of picking that goes on in the Washington Cascades, and there's a lot of picking in BC, where they call matsutake pine mushrooms.
Okay.
And then interestingly, down in Northern California, they grow with different types of trees. They actually grow with oak trees.
Weird. Okay.
And the Native Americans there actually traditionally ate matsutake, and they called them oaks. So kind of funny.
Here it's hemlocks they grow with, so that's
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting.
We were just talking about matsutake in China, and I kind of lost the thread, but you asked how it compared. Their matsutake over there is a little darker, a little browner than ours. Ours are very white with maybe a few sort of maybe brownish tints here and there on the cap. Right. But our matsutake is very closely related. Okay. Same genus, a related species, different species though. But the most prized matsutake for the Japanese is the matsutake that they find in their own red pine forests of Japan. But that matsutake, for a variety of reasons, has been declining. And so they need to look elsewhere. But, here's that sustainability question again. The matsutake is declining for reasons that have to do with forest management and also even socioeconomic reasons. The fact that there's been a huge migration from the countryside to the cities. And so, in the old days, you had people living in villages who would literally go out into their, village woodlot, and they would cut trees for their fires and things like that. And they would keep the ground sort of relatively clean because they were constantly kind of using the deadfall, to burn for fuel and other things. And that's the sort of forest floor that the matsutake really likes, okay?
Oh, okay.
But since you've had this big migration from the villages to the cities, there's less of that. The forests have become more overgrown. There's much more shrubbery now. And the matsutake doesn't like that. And so they've had a decline. And it's not so much that it's been over-harvested. It hasn't been over-harvested. It's just that forestry practices have changed.
People
and also,
create the conditions.
Socioeconomic conditions have changed.
Yeah.
And so they have to look elsewhere for their matsutake. And we happen to have a lot. And so we're exporting tons of matsutake to Japan. But now with the, opening of China and so much infrastructure being developed over there with highways and bridges, all these places that were formerly inaccessible are now available to the pickers over there. And it was really fascinating. When I was in China, I would see these mushroom hunting camps that, except for having Russian-made vehicles that they were driving around in, the camp looked exactly like an American camp,
Oh, interesting.
with these temporary shelters that were constructed, very fly-by-night aspect with a whole sort of barter economy at work. And, even the sort of entrepreneurial person who's not a picker, but is, making noodle soups and selling them to the pickers, right?
So it's pretty cosmopolitan then, the way that the culture around mushrooms works.
Well, it's all over the world. Yeah. And, as I said, China has a much more developed mushroom culture than we do.
Right.
And so your average consumer, your average shopper goes to that farmer's market that I was describing, and they'll stop off at the wild mushroom bins, and they know all the different species and they know what they want to pair with their dinner.
Right.
And so it's more sophisticated than what we have here. But, that's changing. I think people are recognizing that wild mushrooms are really fun to cook with in the U.S. They're realizing that there are all these different species, come in different shapes and sizes and colors, and they have different taste profiles and textures. And especially if you're, my daughter is vegan, and if you're vegetarian, mushrooms are just the perfect meat substitute.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I made a vegan matsutake sukiyaki the other night for my daughter.
That's cool.
It was absolutely delicious, yeah.
Bring me up to upstream and how this book comes about from your mushroom book, and give us the subtitle of that book as well.
Yeah. So, The Mushroom Hunters was a departure from my first book, Fat of the Land, because it was more journalistic. It involved a lot of reportage, and I was following actual, characters sort of, through the woods and I had a tape recorder with me and a notebook and, everything that happens in that book happened. And, Fat of the Land is also those are all real people and everything happens as described. But with the Mushroom Hunters, I really was documenting this culture. And there's a lot more reportage and just sort of a journalistic ethos to that book. And I would say the same is true for Upstream. I really think of this as a trilogy of books because after I was done with the Mushroom Hunters, I knew that I wanted to do another sort of journalistic book with that approach in that sort of vein. And it just seemed like a natural fit to head over to the world of salmon because really, when you think about it, salmon represent the ultimate wild food in North America.
Yeah, I agree.
The mushroom trade was something that most people didn't really know existed. So I was kind of shining a spotlight on this underground economy that maybe people had experienced without even realizing it. If they'd gone to a restaurant and had a delicious meal of chicken and morels, maybe they didn't realize that somebody actually had to go into the woods and pick those morels, and that was part of this sort of larger economy that was at work in the woods, sort of Wild West economy. With salmon, there's no mystery there. Like, this economy has been up and running for a long time. Commercial fishing, obviously, is a big part on both coasts, but with salmon, certainly a huge thing in the Northwest. But the fact that really it stretches back to the first people in North America.
Yeah.
Whenever those first people, and imagine how brave they were, decided that they were going to, and they probably didn't realize that they were crossing a land bridge, across the Bering Sea that was only going to be exposed for a certain amount of time. And the journey probably took, centuries.
Yeah.
Generations, and maybe centuries. But, they slowly made their way. And new studies have suggested that it was really the salmon that kept them alive. There were always salmon that they could harvest. Remember, they were walking through this surreal landscape with, retreating glaciers that might be a mile high, that were just obliterating the landscape as they receded.
And a menagerie of animals that just stagger the mind today.
Yeah, that then went and populated those areas once the ice retreated. But remember, that also took a long time. There might not have been a lot of those animals on the land bridge as they were crossing, right?
Right.
It probably wasn't until they got into North America proper, and then expanded down the coastline and into the interior, that they really started encountering really those incredible herds of animals. But along the way, it was the salmon that made that journey across generations possible. Wow. Because there was a food source that, as soon as the glaciers were retreating, there were new rivers, and it was the salmon that were going up those rivers. They had new spawning grounds, and it's built into their DNA to stray a little bit. So even if 90% of the run goes up the home river, maybe 10% or whatever it is will stray to another nearby river. And that's how they recolonized that landscape that was left behind by the glaciers.
Right.
And it was the salmon bringing those ocean isotopes, inland, in the form of their bodies, that really enabled the land to blossom.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
this is one of the great travesties today, because not everybody realizes how important the migration of minerals from the sea back inland is and was. And now, with so little of it happening, particularly here in the East, we haven't really got to quantify the impact that it's had on our forests, that these salmon, and other anadromous fish too, are not currently bringing back to the inland anymore. So we just keep washing these minerals, like selenium, for instance, out to sea, but they're not being brought back anymore.
Exactly. And I mean, when you go and wander around like Snake River country, that high desert canyon country, and realize, you see that line of beautiful green cottonwoods along the riverbanks. I mean, that was made possible by the salmon. Wow. And then, of course, on the coast, the great old growth ancient forests literally grew on the backs of dead salmon.
Wow.
Yeah. And so it was the salmon that really enabled that landscape to come back to life. And those glacially scoured areas, they could really lack necessary nutrients for life. So the salmon help bring those nutrients from the sea. And of course, the people who subsisted on them, they have a relationship that dates back to the first Americans. And so I was interested in that. The book, it follows, we can call them the user groups, right? Yep. I mean, all the different user groups, whether it's commercial fishermen, tribal fishermen, recreational fishermen, all the and then of course, restaurant chefs who are using salmon in their restaurants, all the different people who use salmon in some way, whether for profit or for spiritual purposes or for nourishment. And of course, it's the person at the fish market, the consumer. Well, that's the most basic relationship that we have right? And that's the largest user group, just the person who goes to the market and buys a slab of salmon. Well, I start the book at that fish market in chapter 1 because I really want to start with the most sort of basic element of that relationship. And, I'm at Pike Place Market, which is, the famous sort of tourist attraction in downtown Seattle, where the fishmongers, they toss the salmon from person to person. It's sort of a showy thing that they do to attract the tourists, and incoming fish, and the fish flies through the air, and some burly fishmonger catches it, and fillets it and gets it ready for the tourist. And so I start the book there because when you see all these people who've come from all over the country, if not the world, to visit Seattle, and they're at the market because they've heard about it, and they are just immediately attracted to those big piles of silver fish. It's almost like it's something that's in our DNA, and you see their eyes popping. It's like treasure that's been mounded on these beds of ice, and it was just so fun to be kind of a fly on the wall. I was actually there during the famous Copper River salmon run, which is actually, and this is another commentary that runs throughout the book. I mean, most of the commercial fishing that happens now is up in Alaska as opposed to, say, Puget Sound, where I live.
Right.
Because for a variety of reasons, we just don't really have the runs anymore that we used to. But, every year in mid-May, those first Copper River salmon arrive from Alaska, and it's a big event in Seattle, and they get the red carpet treatment. They're flown down on a special Alaska Airlines flight, and the captain, in all his regalia, will take them down, take the prize, the biggest fish of the first day opening, down the gangplank, and literally to a red carpet where maybe a few chefs from Seattle are waiting, and they'll have a cook-off for the reporters who are gathered. I mean, there's a lot of fanfare that goes into it. And then you see these fish at the market, and they're not cheap. I mean, they're not cheap.
It's the first fresh salmon of the year.
I mean, typically the salmon season begins in the spring, and there's probably other runs that come in earlier, but it's the first really famous run. People love, their Copper River salmon. And then, of course, there are people who fish other rivers who are like, well, you got to try my salmon. The Taku River salmon are just as good as the Copper River salmon, and so on, and it gets kind of competitive. And then you got someone like me, I live in Seattle, and I just fish our local beaches for salmon. And I make it hard on myself because I mostly do it with a fly rod.
Oh, do you?
And I've really, in the last, say, decade or two, really gotten into the saltwater fishing. It's kind of a fun fishery that's sort of, I guess, newer than some other fisheries, but people are discovering it and getting into it. I mean, salmon
with the fly.
On the fly, yeah. And you can fish, because people think of them as being out there in the middle of Puget Sound, but they come in on the beaches.
Okay.
And they're looking for bait fish. And
they come in big schools?
So sometimes you see schools. Yeah. And then, of course, we have our resident fish in Puget Sound that are always available. And then in the fall, you'll have, really starting in the summer, you'll have the fish from the North Pacific start coming in. And those are the bigger fish. Our resident fish are a little smaller, although they're delicious because they're eating mostly, different types of plankton and like shrimp and things like that. And they just have this bright red flesh. They look like a sockeye salmon, when you cut them open. They just bright red flesh, and they are so tasty, really delicious. I'm talking about our silvers, also called coho. But then, later in the season, we'll get bigger silvers coming in from the North Pacific. And I'll tell you, an 8-9 pound silver puts a nice bend in your 6-weight fly rod.
Yeah, I bet. My mouth's watering too. When you set out to write the book, and I guess compared to when you finished it, did you
Did you start off more optimistic about salmon and all the associated ecology, and end more pessimistic, or did you start off more pessimistic and end more optimistic, or neither of those?
Well, I don't want to use the words pessimistic and optimistic, but maybe there was some skepticism, but also there was some naivete.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I've really sort of structured the book is it's a journey. It's my journey of really learning about these fish, even though, I happen to live right in smack dab in the middle of salmon culture here in North America. I quickly realized that I don't know nearly as much about these fish as I think. So it really is kind of my journey into this sort of layers of complexity surrounding them, whether it's the economic or, the sport fishery or the sort of traditional, tribal culture, whatever it may be. So I spend time with all those different user groups, kind of letting them tell their stories. I'm part of the book, but I really try and, hand it over to my characters mostly.
I remember one guy named Renee that you...
Well, you knew where I was going.
Oh, okay, because I've been meaning to have him on the show, actually. I spoke with him a bit because I was only doing shows. Before COVID, I did all the shows in person. So I need to get back in conversation with him. But I was really struck by that part of the book.
Yeah, so Renee Henry is a fisheries ecologist. He is the Western science director for Trout Unlimited. And he, in a way, he's kind of like my docent in the book. He's sort of like my scientific advisor. Mm-hmm. And I have a lot of adventures with him. For instance, we drive the length of the Columbia and Snake Rivers to follow the longest salmon migration in the lower 48. Wow. Which is the Chinook, also called king salmon, and sockeye, that make the migration up the Columbia to the Snake, finally to the Salmon River, and then into Little Redfish Creek up into Redfish Lake, which is in central Idaho, surrounded by the Sawtooth Mountains. It's about a 900-mile journey. They have to cross, I think it's 8 dams along the way. And over the course of that journey, the sockeye will sometimes lose, 50% of their biomass, of their weight.
Okay.
Yeah, they just burn it off.
Individuals, but of weight, they're burning that off.
Yeah, here's a little wrinkle of salmon biology. Once they're ready to spawn, and they return from their, journeys out into the North Pacific, they will stop feeding at a certain point. Usually as they get close to their home river estuary, they will stop feeding. And then once they're in fresh water, they're definitely done. Mm-hmm. And at that point, they're just surviving on their fat stores. And that's why spring Chinook in the Columbia, which historically, those spring Chinook traveled some of the longest distances of any of the salmon. And because they entered in the spring and held over for months at a time until the spawning in the fall, they had to have really big fat reserves. Mm. And so those were the fattiest of all. And Chinook, also called king salmon, they've always been the most prized of all the salmon, mm-hmm. And certainly by Native Americans. And those spring Chinook were the fish that they really wanted. Those were the most nourishing salmon. And that's what they were largely fishing for. Although, of course, they fished for all of them, but it was the springers, as we call them, that they most prized. And I have a chapter where I go with a guide, a fishing guide on the Columbia, fishing for springers.
Oh, cool! Yeah,
yeah. But yeah, I try and get out there with Renee to all sorts of different places, because as the fisheries ecologist, is really the scientist in the book. Just his knowledge is incredible.
Do you guys get into the water and snorkel at one point?
We do. In fact, we snorkel at 2 different points. In the first chapter, when we meet Renee, we snorkel the Yuba River in California, which has a wild run of Chinook. And in California, the salmon are just on the ropes. Okay. and we snorkel and come face to face with some spawning salmon, and it's super exciting and just really amazing to be in the river with them and seeing them underwater, fisheye view.
Yeah.
And then in the very, very last chapter, which takes place on the Elwha River, right after the 2 dams have been removed, which is the largest dam removal project in U.S. history. And I had a chance to snorkel it right after. And we saw salmon that had returned above the dam sites. And that was just really an incredible experience. These fish are so resilient. As Renee says in that chapter at the Elwha, he says, if we just give them a little space, nature will take care of the rest. These fish, the Elwha project has shown, they have recolonized large parts of the Elwha in a very short period of time. And I think that so far that recolonization has exceeded the estimates of the biologists. If we just give these fish a little room, they'll take care of the rest. And it's not a lot. In the case of the Elwha, those were 2 dams that basically weren't needed anymore. They were holdovers from a different era, and they weren't economically viable. It made sense to take them out. Mm-hmm. But consensus had to be developed, and you really had to kind of get a whole community, and that's the community of Port Angeles, which had previously kind of benefited from those dams, economically speaking. You had to get that community on board. But once a few of the sort of leading people within the community changed their opinions, and changed from not wanting the dams to come out to wanting them to come out, then it very quickly galvanized the entire population, and then once those dams came down, just the recovery of the river was something to behold. And, as I write in the book, they were seeing natural spectacles that people hadn't seen in like a century.
Right. Yeah.
And the townspeople were coming out to just witness these incredible events. Like, for instance, there was a type of fish. Sometimes it's called a candlefish because settlers, it's very oily.
It's oily, right?
Yeah, and they could use it literally as a lantern, like a dried candlefish. Well, they had a spawning or Elwha of candlefish that nobody alive had ever seen.
Oh, cool.
That probably would have been a standard thing back in the day before the dams. But those candlefish brought in all the other predators. So, they're bald eagles and seals and sea lions and diving ducks and foxes even, and all kinds of animals coming down to the river to partake in this just unbelievable feast that was happening.
Wow.
Yeah.
When I think about salmon, it occurs to me that they're a unique species because they're both charismatic and because we eat them. Because when I think about an animal like the elephant or the rhino or the gorilla, its potential to really change how human beings behave in the world, while they're very charismatic and they evoke a lot of emotion, we have no economic or commercial or culinary use for them, which diminishes in some way how much action we're willing to take, unfortunately. And then with salmon, and I'm just curious, if you agree, disagree, or have another opinion. With salmon, it seems like while they represent so much of that wildness you were talking about, but we also eat them, and there's so much commercial use as well and business built around it. And it's such an in-your-face kind of bioindicator that it seems like if any species can get us to start to shift how we're behaving, any species that's on the precipice, it seems like the Pacific salmon might be able to do that. So I'm curious your thoughts on that. And, so many people are writing about it now. I know Kurlansky's latest book where he's really saying sort of, hey, the future of the world is tied to the future of salmon. And, what do you think about all that kind of thinking? And, what do you think about the future of salmon and how it relates to how we treat ecology in general?
Sure. I think that's a great comment, and you're right on there. When I talk to audiences about my book, one of the things I always say is that anything that we do that benefits salmon will benefit us.
Yeah.
So clean water, clean air, having wild rivers to spawn in. Those are all good things for people. The tension in my book is really between the wild and civilization, and how, civilization is not going away. But the wild is, it's tenacious, right? And it's holding on the best it can. I mean, there are a lot of hurdles there, and that's exemplified with the plight of the salmon. I mean, we have really thrown everything at them that we can, and yet these fish continue to return. I mean, I have a chapter about the urban fishery that we have here, right in Seattle, in the Duwamish River, which is our working, river in Seattle, and we've heaped so much abuse on it. And yet, there are still wild fish returning to the Duwamish and then heading upstream to spawn.
Yeah.
And so, if we give them a little room, really what we need to do is we just need to find a better balance. And I think we can do that through the salmon. And that's the undercurrent of the book.
Yeah.
It's that search for balance. And I think that's really what I'm trying to get across to my readership. If we all think about that a little bit more, because the salmon need clean water, and so do we. Right. And they need healthy forests, because that promotes, healthy spawning grounds. But so do we. And I think, during this 2020, what a year, right? I give it the finger. But, where I live here in the Northwest, all the guerrilla camping spots are taken every weekend. And even during the week, I'm seeing more people on the hiking trails. I'm seeing people off trail. I'm seeing people out picking mushrooms and huckleberries. And, apparently I've heard that the outdoor retailers are just selling out their stock left and right. People are getting outdoors. And, when I take my students out and teach them the fundamentals of foraging, I hope that they learn something about how to find these, delectable wild edibles and how to process and cook them. I mean, that's all part of it. But what I really hope is that they will develop a relationship with the natural world. Because if you're a forager and you start to think about things, well, I just think the natural progression is to become a better steward of the land.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, because earlier in the conversation, you said you were talking about back in college and doing some foraging type activities, but you said at that time I didn't really have a formulated philosophy about what foraging means. And so I kind of wanted to ask you that, like, now, you've contributed so much to our community of wild food folks, and you're such a player in it. And obviously you've gotten to do so many different things in so many different places. What is that philosophy today for you?
Yeah. Well, I've never written it out on a napkin, but, but let me see if I can get a few points across here. Because, it sort of shifts a little bit, but overall, what I would say is my greatest hope, when I take other people out to the woods or the waterways, is that they will develop a relationship with nature, and that they will develop a stewardship ethic on top of that. And then sort of the overarching thing is that I want them to have fun out there. Yeah. This is fun. And to have an experience, to have an adventure, to do this with friends, to share food around a table that, you found yourself or that your friends found. Coming together, sharing these experiences is there. And then somehow bumping that up to the next level, which is a recognition that we need to take care of this place.
Yeah.
And that this is the cornerstone of life. Clean air, clean water, food on the table. That's what it's all about. And that we need to take care of our table, and we need to take care of the larger room, that table is in, right?
Right.
And so, but I don't want to be doctrinaire about it.
Yeah.
Right.
No, you don't seem like you are.
No, I want to take people out and have fun.
They're not mutually exclusive things, right?
Exactly. This isn't like, you're going to school and you're going to get graded on this, right? We should all be having fun out there and learning something in the process. And then at the end of the day, having a great meal around the table together with our friends and family.
What's next for you, man? Where's things headed?
Well, I'm working on a new book, and I have to say that, pandemic time has not been necessarily creative time for me.
Yeah, I imagine.
And, I was just out hiking and mushroom hunting with a photographer friend of mine yesterday, and he echoed those sentiments. And I've had sort of a regular hiking buddy during the pandemic. We're sort of potted up, as the expression goes. Mm-hmm. And he's a poet. And, he expresses the same thing. I think all of us who work in the arts are not, you might think that this is a great time to get work done because we're at home and maybe we have more time on our hands. But there's also a lot of anxiety and it's just a strange time. Yeah. So I've really been filling up that time getting outside.
Good.
I've been out a ton during the pandemic. And my project's been on a little bit of hold. And of course, I haven't been teaching any classes. I haven't been able to do that. So it's been a sort of a strange time, but I am working on a new project. And this one is going to be a little bit more personal. So you're going to see similar themes to my previous books. Certainly, nature and the wild and wild foods, but from maybe a slightly more personal angle. And that's kind of, I typically don't really talk too much about my works in progress because I don't know if I'm superstitious or whatever, but until I know that it's happening, I don't want to,
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm looking forward. And if you ever need somebody to read an advance copy, man, put me on your short list.
Hey, you just signed up. All right.
Hey, man, in closing, tell people just sort of where you send them. Where do you like them to buy your books? Where do they find your content and all that kind of stuff?
Sure. You can go to my website, which is langdoncook.com, and then that offers multiple avenues for buying my books everywhere from Amazon to your local bookseller. So probably langdoncook.com would be the best place to go. And then I'm on Twitter and Instagram. And since I have, kind of an unusual name, it's pretty easy to find. Just at Langdon Cook. And you will, if you go to Instagram, you'll see all my mushroom hunting adventures of late. That's what I've really been focused on.
Yeah, you don't have to do the Langdon Cook _46 type thing, do you?
No, I'm pretty fortunate that way. There's not a lot of Langdon Cooks out there.
Well, man, I'm looking forward to getting out your way and connecting with you in person. But thanks for sharing so much today with us and so much of your time. And I think your books are amazing. And like I said, for people who don't read so much but are in their car a lot, they're on audio as well. So, particularly Upstream really impacted me. I think maybe I'm a bit trout obsessed or something, but I was impacted by it. So I really appreciate your work and I appreciate you being here today. Thank you so much.
Hey, well, thank you for having me, Daniel. And I hope that we get to go fishing sometime or maybe go dig a gooey duck.
Yeah, that's it.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.